Welcome to a story that proves the power of empathy and understanding in the face of judgment and anger. It was a typical afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as patrons enjoyed quiet moments, engrossed in their phones or conversations. Among them sat Barron Trump, the youngest son of a former president, dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans. He blended into the crowd, seeking solitude as he read a thick book by the window. Barron's life had always been public. Photographers, headlines, and endless scrutiny followed him everywhere. Yet, here in this cafe, he relished the anonymity, feeling like just another face in the crowd. He was engrossed in his book when a sharp, accusatory voice pierced the air. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" the voice demanded. Heads turned, and the warm ambiance of the cafe froze. A man, weathered and intense, stood glaring at Barron. His clothes bore the wear of a hard life, and his fiery eyes left no doubt about his anger. The sudden confrontation left the room silent, every patron unsure of what to expect next. Barron looked up from his book, momentarily stunned. The man stood a few feet away, his posture tense, his expression fiery. His voice cut through the air again, trembling with frustration. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter. Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" The man's words carried a weight that made the other patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. The barista behind the counter froze, her hand hovering near the phone as she contemplated calling for help. Barron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed his book deliberately and placed it on the table, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the man's agitation. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but soft. "Sir, I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The suggestion seemed to only inflame the man further. He scoffed, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Talk? What could someone like you possibly have to say that I'd want to hear?" Despite the man's hostility, Barron didn't react with defensiveness. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, as if searching for the right words to disarm the situation. Instead of matching the man's aggression, Barron did something no one in the cafe expected. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him and said, "Please, sit." The offer caught the man off guard. He faltered, his clenched fists loosening slightly as he eyed the chair. The tension in the room shifted, curiosity mingling with the unease as patrons watched, holding their breath. The man's sneer returned, though it seemed more defensive now. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you? You'll never know what it's like to live in the real world." Barron didn't waver. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his voice sincere. "I haven't walked in your shoes. But if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." The man hesitated, his fiery gaze softening for a split second before hardening again. "You think I owe you my story? That it'll make you feel better about yourself?" Barron shook his head. "I don't think anyone owes me anything. I just believe everyone's story deserves to be heard." The room remained silent, the man's anger battling with the invitation. Then, after a long pause, he dragged the chair toward the table and sat, his body language still guarded. The man crossed his arms, his jaw tight, as he stared at Barron. For a moment it seemed like he wouldn't speak. But then he took a deep breath, his voice quieter now, but no less raw. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything," he began, his bitterness palpable. Barron didn't interrupt, his steady gaze encouraging the man to continue. "I had a job, a good one, a family. Then the factory I worked at shut down, just like that, gone. Hundreds of us were left with nothing but empty promises that they'd relocate us. Those promises never came true." The man's voice cracked slightly, his tough exterior beginning to falter. "I tried. I worked odd jobs, anything I could find, but when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you." He paused, his eyes glistening. "My wife? She left, took the kids, said she couldn't live like this anymore. The cafe was deathly silent, every patron feeling the weight of his words. Barron sat still, his empathy evident, but he allowed the man to continue without interruption. The man looked down at the table, tracing its grain with his fingers as if trying to steady himself. His voice, now tinged with vulnerability, dropped to a near whisper. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and feel everyone judging you? To see them look at you like you're nothing?" He shook his head, bitterness returning to his tone. "That's my life now, every single day." The patrons in the cafe exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had initially dismissed the man's anger now seemed moved by his words. The man's gaze returned to Barron, his anger rekindled. "And then I see someone like you, sitting here in your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. It makes me mad because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." Barron's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch or respond defensively. Instead, he let the silence stretch, allowing the man's pain to settle. Then, with a quiet voice, he broke the stillness. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," he admitted, his words deliberate and sincere. "But I do know what it's like to feel judged." The man's sharp gaze met Barron's calm one, his skepticism evident. "What could you possibly know about feeling judged?" he snapped. Barron didn't hesitate, his voice steady. "A lot more than you might think," he replied. "Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me, who I am, what I believe, even what I've done, just because of my last name. They don't see me. They see a symbol of something they've already decided they either love or hate." The man's expression flickered, his defensiveness faltering ever so slightly. Barron leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. "I'm not saying my challenges are the same as yours. They're not. But pain is pain. Feeling invisible, misunderstood, or judged is something we all face, no matter where we come from." The cafe remained silent, the other patrons listening intently, their earlier tension giving way to a shared curiosity. Even the barista, who had been ready to intervene moments ago, seemed captivated by the unfolding dialogue. The man sat back in his chair, his arms uncrossing. He didn't say anything, but the shift in his posture was telling. For the first time, he seemed to consider the possibility that he and Barron weren't as different as he'd thought. Barron didn't rush to fill the silence. He gave the man time to process his words, respecting the weight of the moment. Finally, he spoke again, his voice measured. "I'm not here to argue with you, and I'm not trying to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees. And maybe, if we tried to understand each other, we'd all be a little kinder." The man exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out again, but instead his voice softened. "You really believe that?" Barron nodded. "I do. And I think deep down you do too. Otherwise you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking further. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe, suddenly self-conscious of the eyes on him. When he looked back at Barron, his expression had shifted. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone quieter, almost reluctant. Barron offered a small smile, but he didn't gloat. Instead he waited, sensing that the man had more to say. The man's body language shifted, his shoulders loosening as he looked down at the table. After a long pause he spoke again, his voice heavy with reflection. "You know, I came in here mad at the world," he said. "Mad at people like you who I thought had it all handed to them. But maybe I've been carrying that anger too long. Maybe it's not about you at all." The candid admission hung in the air, and the cafe seemed to collectively exhale. The patrons, who had been on edge earlier, now exchanged glances filled with something closer to understanding than unease. Barron nodded, his voice calm. "Anger's a heavy thing to carry, but letting it go doesn't mean you're giving up. It just means you're making space for something better." The man looked up at Barron, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You're a good kid," he said, the words coming out almost reluctantly. "I don't say that often." Barron smiled, his humility evident. "Thank you, and I think you're stronger than you realize." The man sat back, his posture finally relaxed. He reached across the table, extending his hand toward Barron. Barron hesitated for only a moment before clasping the man's hand firmly. The gesture spoke volumes. Two strangers, once divided by assumptions and anger, now finding a moment of connection. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "for judging you before I even knew you." Barron shook his head, his tone sincere. "And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way." The handshake lingered for a moment before the man pulled back, standing awkwardly. He glanced around the cafe, his voice carrying across the room. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too," he said. "I came in here angry. But this kid, he reminded me that sometimes we've just got to listen." The cafe erupted into quiet applause, not loud or performative, but genuine. The man nodded, visibly moved, before turning to leave. At the door he paused and looked back at Barron. "Thank you," he said simply. As the door closed behind the man, the cafe exhaled collectively. The tension that had gripped the room dissipated, replaced by a shared sense of relief and reflection. Conversations began to resume, but they carried a different tone now, softer, warmer, more introspective. Barron sat back in his chair, taking a sip from his now cold tea. He opened his book again, though his mind was far from the printed words. The events that had just unfolded replayed in his thoughts, and he couldn't help but marvel at how a single moment of listening had shifted the energy in the room. Nearby, a couple exchanged a glance and smiled at each other. At another table, a woman put her phone down and struck up a conversation with a stranger. Even the barista, who had been bracing for the worst, seemed lighter as she resumed her work with a small, thoughtful smile. Barron hadn't intended to make an impact when he walked into the cafe. He'd come for quiet anonymity, but instead, he'd left a mark. It wasn't something he sought out, but it was something he couldn't ignore. Before Barron could fully retreat back into his solitude, a woman approached his table. She appeared to be in her 60s, her kind eyes crinkling as she smiled. "Young man," she began softly, "I just wanted to say what you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Barron looked up, his expression humble. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied. "I think we all just want to be heard." The woman nodded, her smile widening. "Well, you reminded us of something important today. Don't lose that kindness. The world needs more of it." With that, she returned to her table, leaving Barron to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a new kind of energy. People were smiling more, speaking to one another with less hesitation, and even performing small acts of generosity, holding doors, sharing smiles, or picking up tabs. As Barron left the cafe, the events of the afternoon stayed with him. The man's anger, his story, and the unexpected moment of connection had left a profound impression. Barron walked slowly down the street, the crisp air filling his lungs. He couldn't help but think about how small actions like listening or offering empathy could create ripples that extended far beyond the moment. The man's story had been painful to hear, but it wasn't unique. Barron knew there were countless others walking through life carrying similar burdens, and he wondered how many of them had someone willing to sit down and listen. Barron's thoughts turned to the man's parting words, "Thank you." Simple, but powerful. They carried a weight that lingered. He realized that in showing kindness and restraint, he hadn't just impacted the man, he'd shifted the atmosphere of an entire room. Strangers had witnessed a moment of connection, and in turn had become a little more connected themselves. Barron thought about how often people react out of pain, projecting their struggles onto others. He wondered how the world might change if everyone took just a moment to listen instead of judge. Barron didn't know if he would ever see the man again, but he knew the encounter would stay with him. It wasn't every day that someone's anger turned into understanding. As he walked through the bustling city streets, he noticed the little things: a mother comforting her child, a stranger helping someone with directions, a couple laughing together over a shared joke. These moments felt brighter now, as if the simple act of empathy had sharpened his awareness of the good in the world. That night, Barron couldn't help but share the story with his family. Around the dinner table, he recounted the unexpected encounter. His parents listened intently, their expressions shifting from concern to pride as the story unfolded. His father, who knew all too well the weight of public scrutiny, nodded in understanding. "You did the right thing," his father said. "Sometimes all people need is someone to listen. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start." Barron smiled, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. The conversation at the café hadn't solved the man's struggles, but it had planted a seed of understanding. The story of Barron and the stranger is a reminder of the power of empathy. It shows that listening, even in the face of anger, can create unexpected connections and transform tense situations into opportunities for understanding. We all carry our struggles, and it's easy to judge others from the outside. But what if we chose to listen instead? What if we approached each interaction with an open heart and an open mind? This story isn't just about Barron or the man he met that day. It's about all of us. It's about the way we navigate our differences and the potential we have to bridge divides with compassion.